Okay, so questions to be answered. So what is reflected XSS, or in other words, cross-site scripting? How does reflected cross-site scripting compare to other types of cross-site scripting? And also, what does a reflected cross-site scripting payload look like? So some of the items that we're going to be checking out. And also, as always, an 80/20 analysis. So, all right, so let's check this out. So basically, we're going to be exploring reflected cross-site scripting just through an example. And what that example is, we'll just kind of say the scenario is basically there's we're going to be looking at a website forum for cat lovers. And let's just pretend a user clicked on a link to show all the cat photos on a site, right? And I'll make this more explicit right here. So the browser request. So basically, a user is just clicking on this link. All right. And the server is going to go ahead and send this response back. And something to kind of note, right, is we see the cat photos, this user submitted query string parameter, right, being reflected back in the response. And that's something that's key with reflected cross-site scripting. Now, think about any problems with this. How could this be potentially abused? Well, basically, the alert is, or the code smell, is basically whenever user submitted input is reflected into the response, there's some items that could really go problematic here. And some people always kind of they question this. They're like, how is this untrusted? Like a user is submitting input that gets reflected back to themselves. Like, who cares? And it's always kind of going back to the fundamental security thinking principle is even though you might think that there is something can't be exploited, it's like there's always unknown unknowns, right? And we're going to go ahead and explore this pretty soon. So let's check out the back end code. All right, so it's pretty simplistic, but basically right here this is like a portion of a server-side template that's being pushed down to the client, right? And I'm just mocking some parameters from the request. So search param, say cat photos, right? And that cat photos is basically being put here through string interpolation, okay? And here's another alert, right? So user input isn't being validated here against a whitelist, right? So we should be doing that. And also, anytime string concatenation occurs with user input, there's a little bit of a red flag, okay? So let's look at that payload that could make this logic have some pretty dire consequences. So let's check this out. Okay, so here's our search, right? But here's the payload right here, and you can kind of just take a second to look at it, and I'll also explain it. And maybe you can try to figure out what it's doing. All right, so basically, as we just showed on the last slide, the server-side template view is this right here. All of this to the end of the string is being reflected or is going interpolated into here, right? Now, here is a view of the response that occurs, right? And we'll see something really fascinating here, and this is key to all types of cross-site scripting, is basically right here, this search parameter was going within this string, right? But that's what this payload right here is actually busting out of that value context. So you see that this is being basically inserted in right here, right? So the value that basically closes off the input tag, and then arbitrary JavaScript or these script tags can then be inserted, which is what you see all up through here, okay? So let's check out the eval order here. So document.cookie, right? When this script tag is then basically run within the browser, right? When it's reflected back into the browser, it is going to run. And document.cookie is basically a string containing a semicolon separated list of all cookies, right? And then document.location is redirection logic. Okay, so that is going to go ahead. So we're basically adding in the cookie here to the string, and then document.location is going to take the result of basically this string concatenation here, and it's going to redirect the browser to, it's basically forcing a GET request to eval.com with the cookie going with it. Okay, so there could be some pretty big problems because eval.com can basically view the submitted cookie string. Now, imagine that, say, Amazon.com had this flaw, right? And say a user accidentally clicked on a link with this malicious payload in it, right? And Amazon went ahead and reflected it back into the Amazon.com just like page on a user's browser. That means that this script tag would have access to Amazon.com's cookies, right? Or the cookies that Amazon.com is setting on the browser is another way to say it. Now, that could be the session information, right? Authentication. So there could be some very sensitive items here that are then sent, in this example, to eval.com, right? So let's check out basically a little bit of a live example, okay, just to kind of show this in practice. So if we go ahead and check out, I have some cookies already set on this domain, okay? And what we're going to see here is a couple of them actually have an HTTP flag that is set. And when that occurs, that makes it so cookies are not accessible via JavaScript, which means that they are immune from basically certain types of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, right? So here is, okay, so we have these flags set. So notice the ones that it's not set on, token and cookie consent status. So what I did is that script payload that we saw in a previous slide, I basically put that into this page right here. Now let's go ahead and send it off, and boom, look, so it tries sending us to eval.com, sees the receiver, and you see that the token, right? So the token comes in, and also if you go to the end here, you will also see cookie consent status. So that's the other one. Okay. So yeah, it's a real life vulnerability, and it's really dangerous. All right, so let me just get out of this. Okay, so let's just do a brief summation. Okay, so process recap. Victim clicks on a link with the payload. Sorry for my formatting here. A victim clicks on a link with the payload, right? And here we just say trusted.example.com payload here, right? So they see a link and they trust it because they look at basically the domain, right? And they're just like, oh, this is fine, right? But unfortunately, it's not. So the payload then goes to the trusted server, right? And then the payload is go ahead and is embedded in the response. In other words, it is reflected back to the user. And then basically that malicious JavaScript sends trusted.example.com's cookies to the evil website. Now, how also, basically, just some other attack vectors is it's tough, right? Because you could just say, hey, just go ahead and just mouse over the link that you're about to click on. Well, it's tough because sometimes you only see the first so many characters, right, of that link. So what some malicious individuals do is they might put a bunch of other kind of crummy query string parameters in here, and then they put the payload right at the end and it's out of view. And then the other thing is link shorteners, right? And that's another real tough one. So you click on a link shortener, you think you're going to say some picture or something else, but then that goes ahead and does some logic as well. So it can be pretty devastating. Okay, so and the reason why the link shorteners are tough is because when you mouse over them, you can't see the full payload. You can't really see any of the payload within the link. So, okay, cool. So where does this really fit into the overarching scheme of cross-site scripting, right? Well, reflected XSS is a type of non-persistent cross-site scripting, okay? There's also persistent, and there's also DOM XSS, where basically it's kind of like a reflected XSS, but instead of it going out to the server, it's actually reflected back in the DOM in certain cases. So anyhow, that's a really fascinating one, and we'll definitely be looking at that into the future. So thanks for joining me for this module.